Oh. Many people in getting the study up and going. So, Shannon, thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm going to be talking about a bit of background to the project. So on this first slide, you'll see a diagram explaining the full set of reports that made up the Warmer Kiwi Homes evaluation. So this consisted of a couple of different phases. So phase 1 was the desk-based review conducted in 2020. And the objectives of this were to conduct a benefit-cost ratio for Warmer Kiwi Homes. And we estimated this from similar programs conducted in New Zealand and internationally. We use this to create a summary of evidence gaps and outline of opportunities to use in an evaluation of the Warmer Kiwi Homes program. Phase 2 is the primary data collection from the Warmer Kiwi Homes heat pump subsidy recipients, and this was conducted in 2021 and 2022. And the objective of this was to measure impacts on health and well-being, indoor environment, and change in electricity use. So from this, we wanted to construct an accurate benefit to cost ratio for the program itself. So this second phase was comprised of 2 key reports. The first of these was the interim report, which covered 127 homes in the first winter after having their heat pump installed. And the second report was the final report, which is the focus of this presentation. And this includes houses from the interim report, as well as additional houses who were recruited in Wellington in 2022. So, in terms of our study design, we looked at 164 houses all up, and these were houses that applied for a heat pump through the Warmer Kiwi Homes program. So to be eligible, the recipient had to be a homeowner in a decile 8 to 10 area, or they had to have a community services card. So recruitment began in April 2021, with us making contact by the phone or by email to households who expressed interest in the program. So we focused on 4 key regions. These were Auckland, Wellington, the Waikato, and Christchurch. Now, before I continue, I just want to note that we split these 4 regions into 3 key climate zones. So these, to split these, we grouped together Waikato and Wellington. So overall, we ended up with 3 cohorts. So the first cohort, we actually named cohort 2021, and these included those who were initially recruited in 2021. So we have data on them from June to September of that year. So this consists of 127 houses made up of 337 people. And we have data over 1 winter. So our second group is the cohort 2021 extension group. So these are people or households from cohort 2021 who chose to stay on in the study for the full 2 years. So we have data for these houses from June 2021 through to September 2022. So 85 of the 127 houses chose to stay on. And this is unique because we have data on 2 winters and a summer, which means we can also analyze their cooling behaviors. Finally, we have the 2022 cohort. So these were houses that were recruited after the interim report. These are all houses from Wellington, and for these we have 1 winter, and for this cohort we have 37 houses. So on the slide, you'll see the study components that made up our data sources. So we created a rich data source from lots of different data sets. So the first of these is the IAQ monitoring devices. So IAQ stands for indoor air quality. And for this, we use devices like EnviroQs and Hobos. And these measure things like indoor temperature, humidity, light, CO2, and dew point. So we got all of this data at a 30-minute interval. And we have data for all 3 of the cohorts, as indicated by the green text on the screen. The second data set is the FlyFlow data set. This provides external weather data. So this gives us information on things like external temperature, ground temperature, and relative actual humidity. So we collected these data points from the nearest weather station to each household. And again, we have this data for all of the cohorts. The next data set is electricity. So we collected this data from all of the energy providers for our households. And this gives us the kilowatt usage for every half hour of the day. And again, we have it for every cohort. Next, we talk about the 3 surveys. So survey 1, or the before survey, was conducted before the heat pump was installed in the household. So this collected data on heating habits, occupant numbers, house condition, well-being, as well as basic demographics like ethnicity, age, occupation, and gender. It's important to note for survey 1, we asked how people felt at the time of the survey with reference to the last winter. And again, we have data for all the cohorts for this. Survey 2 is the after survey for after the heat pump went in. And this has similar questions to survey 1, but with reference to before the heat pump was installed compared to after the heat pump was installed. It also has some additional questions on lockdown behaviours because this after survey was completed around the time of the COVID-19 Delta variant. So we wanted to get some data on lockdown behaviours which could affect heating behaviours. Finally, we have survey 3, which is called the subsequent survey. And this survey was only done by the cohort 2021 extension group. So this was a survey that was issued about a year on after the second survey. It was a follow-up to see how heating behaviours and wellbeing were looking a year on. So this also collected data on cooling habits because we had this information as well. Finally, we have the effigy data. So the effigy data is data that looks at energy usage from the heat pump directly. And this means we can see how energy efficient the device is. So all of this combined was combined into a huge data set, which I fondly refer to as the mega data set. It's quite large. We had to split it into 4 groups because of its size. So in terms of our sample, overall, we had 164 houses that were made up of 437 people. This included 56 houses from Auckland, 82 houses from Waikato and Wellington, and 26 houses from Christchurch. Now, it's important to note, and it has been touched upon already, we did have some difficulties in recruiting households and in accessing materials, specifically heat pumps and monitoring devices, because of supply chain problems, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the Suez Canal closure. These issues led to significant delays in heat pump installations, and similar delays did also occur in 2022 as a result of further supply chain problems. So these changes led to unavoidable variability in the amount of time available to conduct baseline monitoring, but we endeavoured to avoid very short baseline times, so every household has at least a week of data before the heat pump. But one advantage of the variable delays in receiving a heat pump was that the timing of heat pump installation had a large random element associated with it, which gives the statistical analysis some properties of a randomized control trial. So now I'm just going to briefly cover a couple of descriptive stats. So overall, we had an average of 2.7 people per household. The majority of participants lived in small houses smaller than 100 meters squared, and most resided in detached single-story dwellings. Most primary respondents and most household members were of working age, aged 18 to 64, and approximately half of our respondents were New Zealand European or European, a quarter were of Asian ethnicity, 13.4% were Māori, and 8% were Pacific peoples. Over half were male, and around 48% female, and just over 1% were gender diverse. Now, most respondents were working full or part-time, with 45% reporting so. 22% of people in the sample were students, and just under a fifth were retired. It's also worth noting, but not included on the slide, that over 2/5 of households, so 41.5%, received the winter energy payment. So now I'm going to pass over to Arthur, who's going to talk about response.
Thanks very much, Shannon. So the results will cover a number of areas. The surveys included a number of questions on wellbeing related aspects, which included a standard evaluative wellbeing question on life satisfaction. It also included what's called the WHO5, the World Health Organization 5 questions on mental wellbeing, one of which was cheerfulness, on which we concentrated, which is much more like a short-term happiness measure. It also included health and perceptions of cold and comfort and things like that. And then also I'll talk a little bit about the wellbeing results first, then the results for temperature and humidity, CO2, and then for electricity use based on all these monitoring devices. Now, Shannon said all of these results are really pretty much difference results, because we have results after versus before the heat pump was included, and also we had some households that never got a heat pump in the first winter because of supply chain difficulties, and they also had different lengths of time of having a heat pump. So there was actually benefits in the disruptions that we had. So talking about the wellbeing side, I've just put up 4 key areas here, which are presented as difference transitions. So each of these numbers shows the difference in responses between houses that had a heat pump fitted versus houses that didn't have a heat pump fitted, and then whether these places said that this particular aspect had worsened, stayed constant, or improved over time based on their answers to the after survey versus the before survey. So there was a general improvement in life satisfaction. This is asked actually at the very start of the survey before it would be contaminated by any questions about getting a heat pump or anything else, or being warm for anything. It follows the OECD guidelines and making sure this question is asked right at the start. So a net majority of people said that their well-being had improved. Of course, there are a lot of factors that affect well-being in terms of life satisfaction. Some get better, some worse. Cheerfulness, similarly, net benefit, they're more improved than worsened. Not much of a change in self-reported health in the after survey versus the before survey, but if we look at the subsequent survey, it was actually a bigger change. So that's sort of a year, so if you like, more than a year after getting a heat pump versus before the heat pump. There's a more substantive change that we see in that. But the biggest change by far that we do see is perception of cold. And we know from whether it's the General Social Survey or other surveys that we see a lot of people have cold houses, etc. But 76 relative to 4 people said that their house, the perceptions of cold have improved. In other words, reduced perception of cold after getting a heat pump than before. And this comes back a bit to the point that Gareth raised at the very start, that this would only be effective if people actually use the heat pump. So this implies that people were using the heat pump. We ran a lot of statistical regressions, etc. Very, very clear results that we can associate the reduction in perception of cold with receiving a heat pump. There's absolutely, the stats are very, very strong on that. If we look at the regressions for life satisfaction, we can also see that there's some evidence, because we don't have a very large sample, the significance level is less than 10%. But some evidence that people who had the heat pump for longer had improved life satisfaction relative to those who had only just received the heat pump. So statistical evidence is all towards one side. The perceived cold one is very important because previous research to ours by Connell Smith and Caitlin Davies, showed there was a strong association between perceptions of cold and life satisfaction. And in fact, we will use that. Our result for that heat pump reduced perceptions of cold connected to the Smith-Davies result that perceptions of cold is related to life satisfaction as our indicator of one of the well-being benefits of the heat pump. In fact, if we used our estimates for life satisfaction, we get an even stronger effect. So this the way we're doing it is a slightly conservative approach. In terms of model temperature, what I've got here on the board, the blue line is our estimate of how warm the house, the living area of the house would be if there was no heat pump. So HP equals 0, no heat pump. For each of those external temperatures going from 0 to 20 degrees Celsius. And the red line is our estimate of how warm the living area is once they had a heat pump. And you'll see that for all the temperatures up to but not including 20 degrees, there's a significant difference. There's 95% confidence interval shown around each of those temperatures. There's a significant difference between the heat in the living area of houses that had a heat pump compared with those that didn't. For instance, if you look at say 5-degree outdoor temperature, the typical house without a heat pump would have been below 16.5 degrees, whereas a house with a heat pump would have been 18 degrees. So there's quite a major improvement in temperature with very significant results there. And of course, 18 degrees is a temperature that's often used as a desirable temperature for houses to be at a temperature above. We also looked at this by hour of day because this is all based on half-hourly data. So we could actually run the same tests to see whether houses, which parts of the day were houses warmer with a heat pump. And you'll see the two spikes there. One's around breakfast time, 7 a.m. So that's saying that around breakfast time, houses are 1.4, about 1.5 degrees warmer than they with a heat pump than without. And around dinner time, 7 p.m., they're around 1.2 degrees warmer with a heat pump than without. So the times of day when you would expect to see a heat pump having the most use is the time of day that we actually observe. So it gives a lot of credibility, I think, to the results. I should mention that almost all of these houses were using some form of heating prior to having the heat pump in. So this is not heat pump versus no heating. This is heat pump versus the type of heating that they had before they had a heat pump. So they're warmer with a heat pump than they were with their previous heating devices, especially around the two main sort of family times, if you like, breakfast time and dinner time. Interestingly, we also ran a similar sort of test. That was over the first winter. This is over the first summer. We didn't have a control group for summer because all houses had a heat pump in summer. So how could we look at the effect of using a heat pump as an air conditioner over summer? Well, in the subsequent survey, we asked people whether they had used the heat pump, yes or no, as an air conditioner during summer. And luckily, about half the sample said they had used the heat pump and half the sample said they hadn't used the heat pump. So we used the people who hadn't used the heat pump as the control group. And we see there, this is very much an average, and so it's not going to pick up the actual the actual temperature reduction when people were actually using the heat pump, because many days they wouldn't have been. But you can see that the main benefit of cooling the house with a heat pump comes through the afternoon, through the very early evening. As the day gets hotter, people who use the heat pump as an air conditioner have lower temperatures. So again, it's sort of what we would expect to see, and statistically significant in those later hours of the afternoon and early hours of the evening. In terms of humidity, not only were houses during the winter warmer, they were also drier, so reduced relative humidity. The reduction is about 5% of mean humidity or 30% of standard deviation of humidity. And it was also that the greatest reduction in humidity came about when there was high humidity outside. So heat pumps are making the houses both warmer and drier. And we also measured a reduction in CO2. We didn't have strong priors as to what the effect would be on CO2 in the living area. It's possible that people had a warmer living area, left the doors open, they had better ventilation as a result, or whatever. But anyway, it's just an interesting finding. Switching to electricity, this was an area where in our interim study, we didn't have enough power to be able to tell whether people reduced their electricity use or not, but with the second winter, an extra cohort, we managed to look at this. We see it places warmer, of course, but is that just because they're using more electricity, which would then sort of be a plus and a minus? Well, it turns out that this is the effect of across 8 hours of the day of having the heat pump on electricity use. Over the entire day, over the entire 24 hours, the average reduction in electricity use is 16%. This is the household's total electricity use, not just for the heating, but the total electricity use is a pretty substantial amount, highly statistically significant. And we see that there's no real change until breakfast time, and then people are getting reduced electricity use. So in other words, they were heating their homes before with inefficient heaters, and now they're actually getting warmer, but with a more efficient heater being heat pumped, and that's even more pronounced at dinner time. So houses are not only getting drier and warmer, but in doing so, people are using less electricity than they were with their old previous inefficient heaters. And we're going to use those results now to look at a cost-benefit analysis of the program, which Caroline is going to talk to you about.
So the cost-benefit analysis brought together data that Shannon and Arthur described, and it brought that with our understanding of some of the impacts of heating and insulation from previous research and values that we based on the Treasury CBACS database for cost-benefit analyses. I'm hoping this is the right button. No. So the cost-benefit analysis was conducted from a societal perspective, which means we looked at it from the whole of the economy, but we also did a fiscal perspective within that, so just looking at costs and benefits accrued by the government. We used 3 base case scenarios, the first being for insulation, the second for the heat pump, and the third looking at the programme as a whole. Now, to explain these last 3 bullet points, the 5% discount rate recognises that the longer we wait for something, the less you value it in the present. And so the net present value is reduced by 5% for each year that a cost or benefit, you have to wait for a cost or a benefit to be accrued. The 75% additionality recognises that perhaps out of 100 people who got a heat pump through Warmer Kiwi homes, 25 may have got one anyway. So Warmer Kiwi homes helped an additional 75 people out of 100 get the heat pump, and this is then used in the cost-benefit analysis. The fiscal multiplier, or deadweight cost of taxation, recognises that people don't really like paying taxes, and they'll make choices that minimise how much tax they have to pay. And we used a Treasury estimate of 20% for government expenditure in that case, so applying a fiscal multiplier of 1.2 on all government expenditure. And as these are just estimates, we conducted a sensitivity analysis to see what effect adjusting these would have on the overall benefit to cost ratio. These are the costs that were accrued through the programme, and they were provided by ECA. Thank you very much for those. And unless otherwise stated, a societal perspective uses both fiscal and societal costs. When you're looking at it from a fiscal perspective or government perspective, you only include the fiscal costs. And then these are the benefits of the programme. Some are based on previous work, and then we use pharmaceutical prescriptions dispensed to estimate GP visits on the premise that you would need to go to a GP in order to get a prescription, and that didn't include repeat prescriptions. The wellbeing was based on our questionnaire, as Arthur has outlined, and we used the feeling cold question in particular, because that was most closely related with getting the heat pump and the insulation. Electricity use change came from the analysis that Arthur has described, and then we calculated from that carbon dioxide savings. Now, the lowest two, the electricity and CO2, are probably an underestimate because people switch, they don't take into account that people switch from other fuel types to the heat pump, which is electric. So there will be additional savings if people switch, for example, from gas heaters or solid fuel burners to heat pumps. And we do have a lot of data around that, which we can potentially model, particularly in terms of carbon dioxide in the future. And Phoebe is going to talk a lot about how we can use the additional data that we have gained. So quite a few assumptions here that we used in the model, and they're based on what we know about materials and behaviours, including from the survey we did, but also where there are limitations to the data available. So what are known benefits? And these represent the base case scenarios. And from this, you can see that in all cases, there was a net positive benefit to society from the Warmer Kiwi Homes programme. And this comes out particularly strongly when we use the wellbeing indicator, where we have approximately 7 times the benefit over cost for the heat pump, about 3.5 times benefit to cost for the insulation, and 4.4 for the programme as a whole. So those were very big changes when we used wellbeing. And where we just used the physical changes in physical health, again, that showed a positive net benefit. From a fiscal perspective, 52% of spending on the heat pump was estimated to be offset by future health service savings. And that's 98% for the insulation and around 80% for the programme overall. As you can see here, the positive benefit to cost ratio remained when we, from a societal perspective, when we adjusted the discount rate, and that increased because the discount rate was rather than 5% went down to 2%. When we estimated 50% additionality, so 50 out of 100 people got their heat pump because of the programme. And then it increased when we increased additionality to 100%. So nobody would have got their heat pump had it not been for the programme, was that assumption. We then added $150 per annum servicing cost for the heat pump. And that, well, that reduced the, from the societal perspective for the heat pump, the benefit to cost ratio, it remained positive, strongly positive. Obviously, that didn't have any effect on the insulation because you don't have to service insulation. And now I'm going to hand over to Phoebe, who will talk about what else we can do with the data that we have collected.
Thank you, Caroline, and thank you to the team for being part of this team effort. I think it was a great project. So yeah, I get to talk about what we haven't done. So that's great. So hopefully I can't stuff it up too much. So this slide is to just help you all understand what data we have actually collected, which Shannon and gave you a really good picture of near the start, but this is a bit more detail. We have quite a lot of information about the physical attributes of the house. We've got physical characteristics of the type of roof, the type of windows, whether there's shade, a little bit about drainage, and the size and age of the house. We've got housing quality factors. We've got several different measures of mold and damp. We've got condition of the building envelope. So we've got the condition of the physical structure of the house. That's an area that hasn't been examined yet. Obviously, without all our indoor temperature measurements, Shannon mentioned them. I will point out Lux. That was a bonus about using the tether and barbecue equipment. Have a little light meter on them. So, and in a minute, I'm going to show you some playing around. I've had a little wee tutu playing around, and we can see some of those effects, whether they are useful. We've got quite a lot of information about occupant behaviour. We asked them both before and afterwards about heater use throughout the house. So that's an important area that we haven't examined yet. In particular, did getting a heat pump influence how much heating you use in the rest of the house? And we've got a really nice cross-section of both the quantitative measurements and qualitative questions that we asked the householders. So there's quite a lot that can be dug into there about how getting a heat pump has changed occupant behaviours. We also collected the ventilation information. We use the standard GSS, General Social Survey questions. So many of you will be familiar with them, but essentially, do you use the extract fan? Do you open the windows before and after showering and cooking? So those questions mean that the mold and damp and humidity also, there's a lot that can be examined in this data around those factors, and the cold perception, obviously. And importantly, we also asked questions after the heat pump was put in about how they used the heat pump. We asked them about if they had a particular set temperature that they like to put it on. We asked them, do they turn the fan up and down? We asked them, do they switch it off and on every night, or do they leave it on permanently? So we've got a few variables there of people reporting on how they used the heat pump itself. And some of those people, we've got 2 iterations. For those 85 people who stayed in the survey for the second year, we asked those questions when they'd only just received the heat pump recently, and then we asked the same questions again a year later. So that could be another interesting area to examine, whether that behaviour changed when they'd had the heat pump for a bit longer and they'd had a chance to see how their electricity bills looked over a whole winter and what have you. We've got the outdoor data that is that's matched everything in the data set. The wellbeing that Arthur has talked about, basic demographics, including the GSS question about whether people feel that their income is sufficient to meet their daily needs. And the important stuff is this electricity. 2 types of electricity information. We have the whole house electricity, which was gathered from smart meters through the Electricity Authority data hub, and the heat pump electricity. This data, Gareth sort of mentioned, I think it would be fair to say that collecting this data was challenging. And so, despite the fact that we have only 20 houses which have where the heat pump itself, the electricity of the heat pump was used, this actually was a pretty good outcome for us. And the period of the measurements varied from about 1 month to 3 months. And obviously there's no data from before the heat pump was put in because it's attached to the heat pump. But so we installed a monitor as the heat pump was installed. So we've got the very first period of use of the heat pump. And looking through the occupant behaviour questions, I have had a look to see that there is some nice variability there in terms of the reported use of the heat pump. So that in this small sample where we've got the heat pump use electricity, we do have some people who left it on permanently and other people who turned it off and on. So we're really excited, particularly about this information. I think ECA is too. There's a lot that might be able to be dug in into there. The data has been aggregated to half hourly to be matched to the rest of the surveys, to the big data set. But we actually recorded it at 1 minute intervals. So there is 1 minute data. So there's some really fine-grained analyses that might be able to be done there as well. Yeah. So this is, I mentioned I had a chance to do a little bit of playing around with the data. This was actually done in 2021. So this is only from the first 127 houses. And really, I just wanted to show you this slide because it gives us a really good idea about the sample, the particular sample we're looking at here. So these are some housing quality questions, dampness in the house, mold in 2 different ways, and whether they restrict their heating due to cost. Another GESS question that I didn't mention before that is in our data set and in all 3 iterations of the surveys. And also in our first interim report, some of you may remember that draftiness, which is, came out as quite a significant, having a significant impact on both the temperature and the electricity use. So I got quite interested in digging into that, and I was having a real play to see if I could characterize draftiness, associate some of those house characteristics I mentioned earlier with the draftiness to see if I could predict which houses would have the draftiness problems. And that's why these are upside down, because we know that dampness doesn't cause draftiness, obviously. But I was comparing the effect sizes to my other regressions. Anyway, so you can see here that 52 of this sample never had damp. So 50% of the houses were reporting that they were damp. The same with mold, around 40%, 45% are reporting that they have mold in some rooms. This is the question, this mold A4 question is the one that's used in the GSS and also in the census. And you'll see that a smaller proportion had mold of that size. But you can see, and you can see here, only 24, so that's around about only a quarter of our sample said that they never restricted heating due to cost. So I think this really points towards the fact that this is a low income sample. It really is. And we talked before about the fact that the program is targeted to deciles 8, 9 and 10 and people with a community services card. So this shows that the targeting probably was pretty effective. And this is really hugely beneficial, I think, to anyone who's in the housing research area. Probably understands that getting these kind of samples are quite hard. I know I've had quite a few conversations with brands researchers. It's very hard to get these lower socioeconomic people into samples, and so they're typically under-counted, and we have a poverty of information about these poorer households. Shannon's slide also showed that we have above the population proportion of Maori, Asian and Pacific peoples, again, which is quite unusual in a sample like this. So I think this is particularly useful, bearing in mind that Brands' HEAP 2 study will come out in a couple of years. And I think what they'll say is the other side of the picture. They probably won't have many people in their sample who are reporting this kind of housing quality poverty stuff. So when it comes to understanding energy efficiency and electricity use in houses, I think this is going to, our sample is going to be a really useful zone to be used even alongside other samples that are still being created. This is a bit more of my tutu that I had building some models. So since I've got your attention, I'm going to shamelessly pitch my next project. Mainly because I really want to get some feedback, because is it worth doing this project or not, I wonder. I've been thinking for a long time about building a housing system model, which would be based on the actual housing stock of New Zealand. You'd actually like do an address matched and link to council records. So a lot of those housing characteristics that we talked about. So you'd create essentially a housing IDI spine of real data. My suggestion would be that if that was to ever happen, that it should be housed in the Stats NZ IDI. And I have had some initial discussions with Stats NZ about doing this. I'm going to wait till their first census publications come out before I go back and hassle them anymore about that. But then the idea would be that you could build overlay models which would then map onto your housing spine. And so such overlay models could include environmental risk. There's a lot of information available through council records and other modelling that's been done to really deepen our understanding of where the risks are. So, and so another model obviously is this, what I'm calling my housing quality and energy efficiency model overlay. You can see this will basically, because I've been developing this idea for some time, my thinking informed the data collection in this program, which is why I was able to do a bit of playing around here. You can see that I've just used a hand. I really only had 2 days to play around with it here. So there's a handful of things in my model here. So just to give you a quick description. So the outcome that I'm modeling is the difference in temperature inside compared to outside when it's cold outside. So in other words, we restrict it to the times when we hope people will be using a heater, and then we look to see, is it warmer inside than it is outside? And with this handful of data points, which include the hour of the day, the amount of electricity used, the light, the volume of the lounge where the measurements were taken, the floor area of the whole house, whether or not they had a heat pump, and just their climate zone region. We got 30%, explained 30% of the variability with that. So I haven't included any of the occupant behaviour information yet, and there's quite a few other variables even within this data set that I could add in to improve that. Draftiness, which we mentioned, came out as a strong predictor of both temperature and electricity use in the early analyses. We can see that added another 7% of so this was quite exciting for me, because this was early on. Then we got to sort of build in some of this learning into our next surveys. So our follow-up surveys, I've also asked questions about curtains. That hasn't been analysed yet either. And you know, my hobby horse is housing conditions. So I was looking at that here. You can also see that having more external factors in poor condition had a material impact on the difference between indoor and outdoor temperature. So housing quality. So you know, the external condition was predictive of how nice the indoor environment was as well. So I believe that this model would be massively improved just from our own data, and then we could link to other data. Anyway, so if anyone is interested in that, particularly if any of you are from the government, because obviously the real value of such a model that I'm suggesting would be for testing policy, potential policy options. So I'm really keen to hear some feedback from anyone in government, whether they can envision using such a model in their work, And, you know, if I got some positive feedback there of how government departments might use the model or various models, that would help build the case to work on producing this actual farm. Okay, this one. Yeah, and so just to be subtle about it, this is all bring your own funding. Yeah, Motu is a charitable trust, and we without core funding, we work on a project by project funding mechanism, and unfortunately we've used up all the project funding. We got some quite good results from that, but there's a lot more that can be done. We're really keen to see students being able to have a go at some of those questions. We think there's a whole lot of stuff that could make some really good masters. I'm sure there's at least one solid PhD in there. In fact, I would like to suggest right now that drafting this issue would make a really nice PhD. Then we've got data that may support other projects that are already happening. I know there's some people looking into ventilation and stuff. So yeah, if you saw anything there that you think you can use in a project you've already got going, come and talk to us. We're happy to collaborate on projects, but we don't have to be involved in everything. I talked at length about my housing system modelling, but we're also just really keen to facilitate this data having the biggest impact that we can in New Zealand. So thanks.
Thanks. Well, let's open it up for questions, clarifications, ideas, money. Yeah, and we're going to do what we're going to do is one from the audience and then one from Zoom. I think if that works. So yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you for presenting this.
Oh, great. So you're just responding to the last slide. Great.
Sadly, I have to go on the last side. Warmer Study, and I do, as you say, this is pretty small sample size. So I'd be interested to see how applicable you think these results are to kind of the wider New Zealand context, and how you see that we might get an idea of where this kind of sits in that context. And I guess additionally to that, like, where would you like to see this data being used in government policy decisions going forward?
Can I start there and then throw it over to other people? I mean, as you'll see, it's quite a small study for an economist, N equals 164. On the other hand, of course, that's the number of houses. There are huge numbers of data points because it's half-hourly data for each of those houses. So in some respects, it's a gigantic database, and that's guaranteed. Actually, we can't even have it as one state data set because it's too big. It's split up into 4 data sets. So we've got a vast amount of data. We did the power calculations prior to doing the study, and that suggested that the kind of numbers we've got were enough to get statistically significant results, which we did. Clearly for results for electricity and temperature and all those sorts of things, that plus the survey model perception of the cost, which is incredibly strong. So I mean, the sample is easily big enough to answer a lot of questions. There two things. One is the structure of the sample is such that it's only warmer houses that are eligible for warmer Kiwi homes. So it's only houses that are in decile 8 to 10 or with the household and community services card. So we can't generalise this to rich households, essentially, or the households in the rich areas where they didn't have a community services card. But I think the data is incredibly rich, and others might want to talk a little bit further about how we might want to use that data.
I agree with one thought. Thanks. Yeah, I think, like, for example, work done by Connell Smith, who I understand is here, could be replicated. Like, for example, the draftiness question, I think we've got enough data there to do a similar costing on draftiness. And I think draftiness, I didn't say enough about that before, that because draftiness is an issue that's been identified in energy efficiency interventions that have been undertaken all around the world, and they're notoriously problematic in not being effective and also often having unintended consequences. So you don't want to run a race in and do an energy efficiency intervention without really understanding the housing stock that you're looking at. So I think there's excellent data to use to help develop an evidence-based intervention for draftiness. And there might be other things that can be costed as well. With the 164 households, but there was 440 people. So yeah, so and we were really lucky in the sample that it spread itself out nicely. So there's a really good variability in there anyway.
Anyone, you want to pull one out from Zoom?
Yep. Is there a, just so that it'll. Okay, there's only one question from the Zoom participants at the moment, which is, were there big differences in comparative outcomes with heat pumps against electric heaters and gas heaters? Did the study include hot water heating as well?
No, it didn't include hot water heating, and I don't think that we've done some more analysis with the gas and solid fuel. But that is something that could be extended and done because we do have that information.
Yeah, I mean, if I just, we have got the information of what heaters they were using prior to, and the type of hot water, but they presumably they wouldn't have changed that too much. But we do know what kind of heating they were using prior to getting the heat pump in the living area, so we can definitely do further work on that. And we did actually do some work on that with Warmer New Zealand, because in that one we did have gas use as well as electricity use, so that's something that's definitely worth looking at.
I did have a second thought on that one, that some of the electricity data actually splits controlled and with not controlled, and the control is only used for the hot water cylinder, so we do have some information on that for some houses, and potentially a comparison between those two types.
Yeah.
Sustainability trust. Because I have a question around the temperature. Was it just temperature of the living room, or with the whole house, and then just also considering how a single heat pump did affect, I guess, temperature throughout the whole house? Just thinking about we're all angling toward the whole house heating and the affordability of that versus our generally poor housing quality, and I know there's income status, and we're quite interested around the whole affordability of maintaining 80 degrees throughout the house. So just wondering how the study interacts with that.
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Phil. That's a great question. And yeah, we actually have collected some really useful data that we haven't yet analysed. We specifically asked people, I think the question was basically, do you use the heat pump to heat the rest of your house? And some other questions around that. And we've also, remembering we've got the use in every room, self-reported, before and after, so we can verify what they say in the qualitative answer with those other information. So we can make some estimates about how we can definitely do some analysis of the whole house change in temperature from that information.
Emma, did you have another one or not?
Yep.
Okay, Emma, so we'll go to Emma
Sorry.
first, somebody on Zoom first, taking turns.
Someone had a question, which is very interesting results, but noted applies only to homeowners. Given the energy hardship has a strong weighting to renters, can these findings be generalised in any way to renters? If not, is it feasible to look at a parallel renters study?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's correct. I mean, it's homeowners and they have to be in SI10 or have a community services card. I mean, if they've got a community services card, they're going to be low income people, where this is going to be homeowners. So we can't generalise it at this stage to renters, but the point that was raised is a very good one, that there should be funding for a similar scheme of renters, and we would be very interested in talking to the funder that would want to do that. So that's a great question.
Hi, thank you for that. I'm Diego from the Public Health Agency, and I just wanted to understand if you attempted to show any correlation between your studies and health measures like hospitalizations or school attendance or job absenteeism, and if there's any way to correlate the cost savings from installing a heat pump and the cost savings of reducing those health impacts in the population.
Yes, so that was done where we looked at general health rather than the wellbeing question, and that was based on a PhD thesis which looked at the health impacts from, I think in that case it was insulation, but we did have some heaters in that study, and there are odds ratios and risk ratios related to that. I can give you the name of those papers.
Brilliant.
So we're using the study.
Just to clarify that, that's not data that we picked up in this study. We were using data from previous studies to feed into our cost benefit analysis, but there's been a lot of work on that. Also days of school and all sorts of things that people have looked at, days of work, days of school, and things like that. So there is lots of information from prior studies on that which we drew on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Just to conclude, was the model for one heat pump per house, and what about the effect of degree of subdivision into rooms on ability to heat all of the house well?
I think that was similar to the question Phil asked. So it's based on the living area, and that's measured. For the living is basically the living room, and any rooms attached to that don't have a doorway. So if there's no doorway to the corridor, then the corridor will be included. If there's a combined kitchen, living room, that would be included. It was only for one heat pump, but the heat pump was measured to be able to produce heat to heat up the whole of the living area as I described. And as Phoebe said earlier, we did specifically ask people, do you heat the rest of the house using the heat pump? And a lot of, we got the answers from people who said that towards the end of the evening, they'd open doors, they put the fan on the heat pump to the highest setting they could, and that would help push some of the warm air into the other rooms. So that was done, but we don't have specific measurements for bedrooms at this stage.
Kia ora koutou, ko Pita Tokuinga from the Public Health Agency as well. I had a question. I'm not sure if I know any of the research behind it, but specifically with what temperature the households were having the heat pumps at, because I know there's some stuff coming out maybe that 20 degrees would be better than the baseline of 18. I wonder if anyone can speak to that.
Yeah. Well, I can start with that. So the recommendation is 18. So our differences were worked, I think work previously was based on 18 degrees. The average temperature was around about 20 degrees. It was variable, and people would certainly when they initially got the heat pump, they sort of turn it, round it right up to sort of 20, 25 until they got warm, and then it gradually work its way down. So most people kept the temperature within the range, but the average was, as you said, 20 degrees.
Thanks. Yeah, we've got information to dig into that really deeply, because especially with those 20 houses with the monitor on the heat pump, and then remembering we've got the half-hourly indoor temperature as well. So we're actually, one of the questions we think we might be able to answer is to definitively show whether it's better to leave your heat pump on permanently versus turning it off when you go to bed or off when you go out. That was kind of one of the thoughts behind the way we collected the heat pump data. But also, I think there's quite a lot we can dig into there about matching people's use, the behaviour, the use of the tuning it up and tuning it down, and what impacts those have on the overall energy efficiency. You know, is it better to just leave it on at a set temperature, or some people turn it up to 27 for half an hour and then just turn it off. Actually, interestingly, we also asked them about whether some people, you know, there's special deals where you get 1 free hour of electricity use. And yeah, that person who turned it up to 27, yeah, it turned out they were someone who used the free 1 hour, and they were like literally cranking every single appliance in the house. So there's some interesting stuff here as well.
And I was just add, of course, you know, from a health point of view, 21 is better than 18, but I'm an economist, so you've got to think about the trade-off, and that's possible to heat to out to 20 than 18. So you know, to think about both of those areas and what's efficient, I suppose.
A question from someone on Zoom. What do you think about expanding the program? I assume they mean the government program, towards additional solutions, i.e. retrofit external wall insulation, mechanical ventilation, retrofit double glazing.
I'm going to hand this to Gareth. We're under the house rules, by the way.
Well, that might be one for me. As a very general comment about the evaluation and some of where to from here, picking up on Phoebe's point as well, I think, you know, the one question that we had, if you wanted to boil it right down to one question, it was, are the heat pumps doing what we want them to do? And so, a very clear outcome of this evaluation is yes. So, big tick there for ECA. We can continue to do what we currently do, knowing that it's the right thing to do. I think in terms of what we do going forwards, it's a really good opportunity for the wider community, I think, to be picking up the data that we've got now and really crunching the numbers to show where those benefits might be. So that's definitely one part of the answer. The second is that alongside the Green Building Council, ECA have been doing a project over the last 12 months or so, looking at the case for a wider range of retrofits into houses. And we're hoping to bring that out in the next few months, and that will partly address that. I think just a final point, maybe, you know, heat pumps really do change the equation, though. It's quite interesting. So because heat pumps are so efficient at producing heat from electricity, you know, you've got this sort of multiplier of 3 or maybe 4. And again, I think there's further work to tease out that from the data we've got. It does sort of change the equation and the economics around how far you go with other retrofits. So we're kind of happy with where we are, and we're going to be making incremental changes as well going forward. But in terms of kind of new things, there is really tough calls to be made economically.
Yeah, at the back there. One, thanks.
Thanks. Jeffrey from Electron, with the Alliance Company for Urban Capital. Firstly, thank you for the presentation. I thought it was very informative. Do you guys know what the change in peak demand for the houses were before and after? From our perspective, all our infrastructure gets planned around peak demand consumption, and going forward with the decarbonization story, we're looking at electrification as the main means for it. So it'd be lovely to know what the increase or maybe decrease in peak demand will be.
Yeah, and we can answer that from the which I'll see if I can pick up that picture. What time would you say your peak demand is? Yeah, so I was hoping you'd say that. Yeah, so this is the effect through the hour of the day of electricity use of getting of houses. Essentially, think of these houses as replacing old inefficient heaters with a heat pump. Okay, 85% of houses was using heating before they got the heat pump. And so you see, you know, there's a little bit of a reduction in your morning peak time, so sort of 7 till midday. So, you know, especially around that breakfast time, there's a smaller decline and then a much bigger decline late in the afternoon, early evening. So your peak hours are actually oddly, we're giving people an electricity driven device, and it's reducing the demand for electricity and they're warmer. So it really is important from a peak time. It's a great point, actually. We also thought about this when we were coming to the carbon dioxide reductions as well, because as to whether there was any benefits in reducing coal and things like that. But it turns out, I think, Gary, you can correct me, that once you put a coal power station on, just put it on for half an hour, you put it on for quite a long time. So you couldn't just get the same sort of peak sort of reductions in carbon as much as you would otherwise.
Just a minor digression on that. There's often this assumption that the grid is sort of dirtiest and most polluting at peak demand time. It's actually not. There's some really nice research from the University of Otago which shows this, which is that on a cold winter's day where there's forecast to be very high peak demand, what happens is the coal gets turned on at lunchtime, maybe even earlier. And so as you actually progress through the afternoon and you progress towards peak demand, it's actually the hydro that's ramping up. So the grid's actually getting cleaner as we go to peak demand. But of course, that doesn't mean that if you didn't have a lower forecast of peak demand, you could not have lower emissions. So it's really that sort of counterfactual. And especially the electricity systems, you've really got to make sure that you're not just chasing one little kind of impact. You've actually really thought about the wider system impact. And so I suppose, as Arthur said, we're replacing electric heaters with electric heaters, but we're seeing a decrease in electricity.
Did you have another
one? Yeah, just one more. Is there more to be said about running the heat pump non-stop? Might have already answered that.
There is a lot more to be said, and we wanted to do good work. So it's seamless time to be done.
Yeah.
But I think there is a debate, because my understanding is that perhaps Grants and Nika may have different views on this, or different people within those organisations might have different views. And this would be, I think we actually have the data now to be able to produce something meaningful on that. Is that right?
I think we've got the best data that's been collected to answer that question, in New Zealand. I really hope it will give us some really strong answers in that. Yeah, I guess the one of the ideas behind that is when you heat up your room, you're not just heating the air, you're actually heating all the surfaces as well. So that's what we call thermal mass. And so when you turn the heater off, you lose all that thermal mass, and you have to heat everything up again, not just the air. So that would be the reason why it might be cheaper to leave it on permanently. But yeah, we're really good to find out.
And one last question from the audience. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Fransky and Steve, the Autistic Performance Branch. I'm just wondering if you had any assumptions around maintenance that heat pumps require all the time, and the expected lifespan, and also was maintenance considered as a cost?
So it wasn't put as a cost in the base case scenario, but then we added cost in the sensitivity analysis, and that's approximately, I think, $150 a year for servicing the heat pump, and that was based on the assumption that people would wash and clean their own filters for the heat pump on an annual basis. And on that basis, I think we estimated 10 years for the heat pump. A lot of people's heat pumps do last longer than that. So our assumptions were on the conservative side.
I don't think we've got any questions in the survey, do we, about whether people actually maintain their heat pump? Do we do that? No, which is pretty good. Would have been a nice one to ask, and then to see whether there's any difference after a couple of years as to whether their output was any different, but we don't have that information. Okay, well, let me conclude it there. I think we've had a great set of questions, both from Zoom and from the audience. I just want to, thank the team that did this work, and Hannah helped as well hugely in phoning up everyone and getting the 164 households to participate, etc. And which was an extraordinary job. And but also thank ECA and for, as I said, not just for the funding, but actually for realising that for public policy to work well, people have to work out how to evaluate programs, and it's just done so infrequently. And the evaluation has to be done before the program is implemented. It has to be done when the program has been thought about, so you can actually get the before observations and the choice of how to randomise or get quasi-randomisation of households that are being treated, etc. So this is just such an important public policy thing, and yet agency after agency after agency forgets to do it or chooses not to do it. So I just really want to thank ECA for actually doing this right. So thanks very much, and thanks to the other ECA people here, Henry and Kate was here for all your assistance, and Gary. Thanks very much.